Good evening. I'm Shalini Prakash. On behalf of all the faculty members of 8th semester design, I welcome you to the 4th of the semester's lecture series. I'd like to thank architect Dinesh Rao for inviting our guest speaker, Dr. Usha Rao, this evening. The lecture today is part of the design studio where we intend to recognize and explore the position of architecture in an urban context. It will be a discussion about the stories and myths of Bangalore, and it will also discuss what it means for the places and people of the city. It is titled City and its Puranas. The session will commence with a discourse by Dr. Usha Rao, post which the students could discuss their studio work with her. Dr. Usha Rao has a PhD in anthropology from UMass Amherst, Massachusetts, and IIT Delhi. Like the proverbial cat, she has several professional lives. She's produced and directed along with Gautam Sonti a feature-length documentary called Our Metropolis, which follows Bangalore's transformation. We are delighted to have you here today, ma'am. I invite you to begin the lecture.
Thank you for that introduction, and apologies, I had some technical issues, so do forgive me for that, but I hope I'm audible. Yes?
Yeah.
Okay. So, so as the title of the talk says, it is a small talk about stories of the city. Now, there are many kinds of stories. You can think of stories at many levels. There are the myths around Bangalore and the founding myths of Kempe Gowda, and whether or not it was, there is another myth that surrounds Bangalore as this sort of mythical city of magical lakes and underground water bodies. So there's lots of stories around Bangalore, but today I'm actually going to focus on not such an exotic story, but two kinds of stories. One is I'm just going to talk a little bit about places, and places have myths that surround them. And so I am going to talk a little bit about place myths, or Sthala Puranas as it's called. And I'm also going to talk in particular about a certain area of the city that most of us are very familiar with, which is MG Road, and which now houses the Metro Rangoli Center. And I'm going to go a little deeper into along MG Road and look for ghosts along the way. So that is the kind of scope of my talk. And I'm going to link this up to something that, that we all hear about. One of the big Puranas that link the meaning of Bangalore is that of the Global City Purana, which is, we are supposed to be a global city. We're supposed to be a world-class metropolis. So I'm going to look a little bit into that as well. This, what I'm going to share with you is just my ideas and my perspective as somebody who has engaged with the city, not only as sort of a quote unquote native of the city, but also as in my professional capacity as an anthropologist, as someone who's been a filmmaker, engaging with the city. I also work with sound, I work with stills. So I'm constantly engaging with the city. So the perspective I bring is mine. And this is just to say that I'm not a planner, I'm not an urban, I'm not an architect. So my take on the city may be a little different. And I'm just asking to be that you engage with it, and maybe we can discuss it later. So back to this idea of the Sthala Purana. I don't know, I think many of you will be aware that places, especially quote unquote sacred places, it could be a temple, it could be a pilgrimage place, they typically have something that is called a place myth. That is a story that links the place and gives the place in its meaning in the context of a larger world. These could be deities, it could be demons, it could be other worlds, celestial worlds, underground worlds. Essentially, it links the significance of place which is located on a terrain to worlds that do not exist in a material form. So that is what a Sthala Purana is. Now, I play with that word to say that, all places have a story. Let's look at MG Road, and let's look at the Metro Rangoli Center. Surely that has a story too. And that has its own Sthala Purana, which we sometimes may not even engage with, because our eyes get used to change. Our eyes get used to taking in changed landscapes, and which become normalized. So I'm going to look at this. Now, what is its story? What are the worlds, links it has with other worlds? Here's some images of the metro, MG Road Metro Station complex. And this is it's a signboard of the Rangoli Metro Center, which defines all the various spaces that it includes and the uses that these spaces have. And I have actually studied this place as an exercise in trying to understand how place is made, because as designers, you all are very familiar with the fact that urban designers, that that places are actually made. They don't drop down from heaven. We intervene, we design them, we imagine them, and we put them into practice, and finally they're used. So I looked at this place through the lens of an anthropologist studying place, and I looked for cues. I looked for in what ways is it, what kind of a place is being made, how is this place being made, how is it designed, and what is the kind of even linguistic, how is language used, how is signage used to create a new meaning for this place, which actually has a very long history. So suppose we even go beyond it, and the sort of the documented history of this MG Road goes back to the colonial times, as many of you already know. And the ridge that the ridge that sort of ran along what was then called the parade ground was a high level. And possibly that was where water used to run off. I don't know if you go beyond when even before it was even constructed, perhaps it had other kind of its terrain was much different from what we inherited in the post-British. But essentially that high ridge was a very popular boulevard, where typically the British people who inhabited the cantonment would take the air. So it was a boulevard where people walked in the evenings and took the fresh air, as the expression goes, and it was known as the Rotten Row. And so it was highly fashionable, I guess, and it was also it was also restricted space in those days, because you had to be a resident of the cantonment. From then on, by the time we came to the 40s, 50s, post-independence, it was known as South Parade, because it edged that was where it edged this parade ground, and that was where the parade used to move. So, and then from when it became post-independence, it was renamed MG Road. And the image we see is possibly from the late 40s or 50s, by the way the cars look. So this was like an open boulevard running along the main drag with restaurants and cinemas and other places of entertainment. This is from not so long ago also, which was when, before the metro construction started, the MG Road Boulevard was and for those of us who are Bangalore residents and older residents of Bangalore, this was a place where you could walk, you could sit and eat kallekai. It was a public space. You were not charged an entry fee. You were not stopped from entering. There was a public bathroom below, a very dirty one, but it was there all the same. And you could walk around, you could sit down and chat, you could just loiter, and it was basically an open area for anyone who would want to walk. And some of us used to walk down the entire length, because it took us from one place to the other, and we could avoid MG Road altogether, but walk along the side. And it was rather pleasant. It had lovely grand trees. There was bougainvillea wines, etc. So this is a kind of a public space. From then, if you look at it now, there's certain things that have changed. So I'm suggesting that this place has been transformed from a place that allowed for walkers and for loiterers and flâneurs to just come and hang out, to a place that has to be used by users and consumers and visitors who have to register their presence in that space before they can use it. Am I audible?
Yes, Usha.
Hello?
Yes.
Yeah. So now I come back to the Rangoli Center and say that what are some of the ways in which this place is produced? After all, there was an open boulevard. There was which had open access. Of course, it may not have been very safe for women in the evenings, but still there was no restriction in the sense of there was no sentry, there was no, you didn't need to register who you were in order to walk in, and you could just walk in without spending money. You didn't have to use the restaurant or the cafe or anything. So how was this place produced? Now, a little bit of background. There was an uproar actually when the metro acquired the boulevard and the trees were cut and the boulevard was broken. Because a lot of, especially middle class, old Bangaloreans felt that they were losing an open public space for good. So then the BMRCL proposed that they will use this land to make a very fine kind of a public space that would be accessible to all, and it would be a very good and creative use of space. So they designed it in such a way that they had they had an art gallery, they had kiosks for selling stuff, and they had an open sort of a performance space. What I'm suggesting is that if you look at, if you engage with the space, it becomes very clear that it is designed with a certain kind of user in mind. And we can discuss it when we have the discussion. And it is also curated. What do I mean by curated? Someone decides who can come and sell their wares there. Someone decides what kinds of activity is allowed there. And it is also managed. So it is something that is supposedly public, but it's not quite open to everyone. And there were one or two very curious things that I found when I started engaging with that place. For instance, the use of signage. This says Huvina Hadi, which means a path covered with flowers, like a flowery path. Now, the sign is in English, but the word is in Kannada. Who are they addressing? And what kind of place are they creating by the usage of a signage like this? Something to think about. Again, we can come back to it in the time of discussion. The other very interesting signboard I found was the Nagaratpete signboard, which, as many of you know, actually refers to the historic Avenue Road, this is an image of Avenue Road, which is the chalk in Avenue Road, which is the Nagaratpete, which is the heart of old medieval Bangalore, and which is the market hub, was and continues to be, which ironically was slated for widening when at the same time that the metro was built or commissioned to be built, there was a plan that Avenue Road would be widened because it somehow it needed to be widened because they had to find access to the airport. So I found this sign very, very, and by the way, these are all people who are housekeeping staff walking here because it needs a huge housekeeping staff to keep this clean. So I was thinking, why is Nagaratpete here? And how does the sign of Nagaratpete relate to the kiosk where people can come and sell their jewelry or their various kinds of produce which they have to pay to in order to be allowed in to sell? And how does it relate with the old Nagaratpete, which is completely from a different context? Okay, so walking further up from MG Road. So from MG Road, I've walked further up and I've come to this point. which is the entrance of MG Road station. And I stand here and look across here. What do I see? I see the entrance of the MG Road station, which is the other end, which is the plaza end. And here's where I begin to see ghosts. This is the open, shiny floor and the long extended station. But then this is the point where Phoenix Watchworks stood. And so whenever I stand and look across, I see the ghost of Phoenix Watchworks, and I see Ramchandra Sharma standing at the doorway. And this, along with Plaza, you can see the doorway of Plaza was knocked down to make space for the metro station. So that's fine, public works often take over private property, and they take over. This gentleman, by the way, was a tenant, so he had to give up his business of 80 years, which his father had started, in order to make way for the metro. But what I find interesting is that when I look at places like this, and remember, I started off by saying that all places have stories. So there is no tabula rasa, nothing is built over nothing. So when I look at any place, what I wonder about is what stood there, what happened to it, and what happened to the people who actually had inhabited it. And when I come and stand in front, and this is a signboard which says that there is, that they're looking for rentals for retail places inside. This large cavernous station has been carved out of the Plaza Theatre and Mr. Sharma's shop, and today there is no sign of it anywhere. But if you look really hard, you may see you might get a glimpse of his shop. And this is the kind of ramp that leads out, and this is where he used to have his other window, and he would often sit there. And this is the interior of the metro station, where nothing is there. It's empty. It's not used in any fashion. And that's exactly where his shop used to be. And here he is at his desk. That's him. And he had a routine. He used to go from his Phoenix Watchworks exactly at 11. He used to walk down, go to the bank, which was in the Shringa shopping center, which is now again going to be demolished, and do his bank work, and come to India Coffee House and meet his old buddy Len Shepherd, who's an elderly Anglo-Indian gentleman who used to work with the Binnies. And there he would have his coffee exactly at 11:30. So you could walk into India Coffee House, which is also now the Titan shop, by the way, and you could be sure to spot the two of them. And once the shop was acquired, he was completely lost, because his whole idea of, from being a child, when he used to bring coffee for his father, go to India Coffee House and fetch coffee in a flask, to an adult who ran the shop after his father, his whole routine revolved around 2 or 3 points on that road. And he was completely lost once he knew that the shop would go. Okay, so why was Ramchandra's shop taken over? It was taken over for the metro. But what is the larger design in which I see the metro in? Again, remember, I'm talking from my perspective. Where does the metro fit in the larger design of the city and the city's stories? So it very clearly is sort of within this context of Bangalore as a global city. And the whole idea of Bangalore becoming a global city is one which actually set off a whole series of processes of change and transformation within the city, whether it was widening of roads, or whether it was clearing out of pavements from street vendors, or massive demolitions that took place. transfer and a passing and a change in land use and land ownership, the coming of large real estate groups, international real estate, and the entire, the kind of a morphology of the city, or the kind of visual landscape of the city changed very dramatically from the early 2000s, when there was this where there was a, by the state took on upon itself the task of redeveloping Bangalore and making it a global city. So why is Bangalore a global city only in the millennium? After 2000s, I mean, wasn't it always articulated with the globe? It was a textile hub after all, and it continues to export a lot of textiles to the world. But somehow there is the feeling that it's the IT-BT that defines Bangalore post-liberalization, and that Bangalore had to be upgraded to become a global city because it had to sort of fit the needs of what is, of what these large kind of global enterprises require. So the idea of the global city became a kind of a entered into planning, and entered the sort of the city planning discourse, and the government sort of embraced it. Just to step back a little bit, what does this have to do with the idea of the global city as we see defined by somebody like Saskia Sassen, which was way back in 91. She talks very specifically about the global city as a node in which global capital is located and controlled. And she's talking within the context of organizing of the world economy. And very specifically, she's talking about London, New York, and Tokyo, which are specifically linked to financial flows and technological and other kinds of, where there is an agglomeration of controls. She's also talking about the fact that the global city has its underbelly, that there are fissures, there's inequality, it's uneven, and she's laying it out there as well. But what is kind of curious is that what began as a kind of a discourse or an idea within very defined disciplines like geography and sociology found its way into how cities are thought about and imagined, and what urbanization should look like across the world, especially in the quote unquote third world or the South. So it entered it in a very abstracted way, which glossed over some of the finer details. So it has actually very little relation with what Saskia Sassen and others are saying. So and the global city became kind of synonymous with world-class city. And the world-class city has its own kind of connotations. So if you look at, something like the Abide document, which came out in 2008, or when the BJP first came into power in 2008, they took upon themselves that they want to make Bangalore a global city and a world-class metropolis. So, and it's sort of, but they were not the only ones. At the same time, in the early decade of the 2000s, across India, you see cities wanting to become like some city elsewhere in the world. Like Bangalore wants to be a Singapore, Bombay wants to be something else, Karachi wants to become Dubai, and something else wants to become a Shanghai. So it became a kind of a very commonplace thing for city governments and state governments to push development of a certain kind within these large metro cities. So it became a kind of an ideal that you want to strive for, because if you want to participate in the global economy, you needed to have a certain kind of infrastructure, metro being the icon actually and the poster child of a global city. And you needed to have it had to have a certain kind of look and feel, at least in some parts of the city, in order to qualify as a global city. And there were kind of global city indices that came up, which would rank cities, give them a hierarchy. And you can it's quite fascinating to look at all of this. And it was all, you can just easily find it. So this reinvention of Bangalore started happening in the early decade of 2000. And it became a kind of an aspiration, and which allowed Bangalore to become comparable to a Singapore or a Hong Kong. Not really London or New York, but mainly we're looking east. And as some of the theorists like Iva Ong say, cities wanted to actually in the global south wanted to be like other cities in the global south, like Kuala Lumpur or a Hong Kong, that would reflect their kind of worlding, what she calls worlding ambitions. That is, they proclaim that they are global players. So, and this went alongside sort of branding of cities. And when cities started also competing with each other. For instance, Bangalore was pitted against Cyberabad to attract, which is Hyderabad, to attract investments in the IT sector or to woo capital. So so that also started happening, and so you needed to have all these kinds of things, infrastructure, all certain, as I said, a certain look and feel in order to sort of qualify to be a global city. I'm sharing with you something that came out of a website, which actually is trying to woo people to come and invest in Bangalore. And you can read that Bangalore is undisputably the IT capital. The city has opened its gates to world-class housing, superior education systems, and fine healthcare facilities. Let's just take that with a tub of salt. Bangalore offers the perfect ambience for every businessman and entrepreneur, with world-class living facilities, dependable infrastructure, and excellent work ambience. So come home to Bangalore. So it's a kind of advertising of the city as a brand. Okay, so I've got, as I'd said earlier, so it sort of entered the urban imaginary. The city has to look a certain way, and it has to project its global status. One way to project it is by having a metro, by having buildings that look a certain way, roads that look a certain way, and bringing about order, cleanliness, a rational way of organizing the city, which is why pavements and hawkers and vendors on the pavement do not fit this, nor does the old kind of winding lane logic of an avenue road fit this. So it's the kind of material that is used, the kind of design that is used, all of which have to signal globality. The funny thing, though, is the more we look at the future, it looks more and more like the past. Because if you look at the roaring buildings that came up in the roaring 20s, the kind of spires and the tall buildings continue to be the kind of ideal that we still see in our cities. So this is y'all are architects, so this is not new to you, but I'm just putting it out there because I'm sort of building my argument on this. This is an interesting thing. This film, Fritz Lang's Metropolis, maybe some of you have seen it, which was made, and it was actually released in 2007, is set in the city of the future of 2030. And quite interestingly, the kind of cityscape that the director, Fritz Lang, has shown is very much like, it's got overhead bridges, it's got lines, it's got flying taxis, which are very similar in some ways to what we see in cities now. And this is our very own design of Alsur station, which doesn't look like this at all, but this is one of the proposed designs. So, I mean, so you see this reflected in Bangalore as well. There's a certain kind of aesthetic that is reflected in what I would call the new Bangalore. This is MG Road post-metro. Some of the old buildings remain, as you know, but a lot of it has changed on the road. And this is the reflection of the old in the new. Right. So there is a certain kind of aesthetic that is associated with this global city. And in the case of this, I'm drawing from historian Arif Derlik's work on Hong Kong and Shanghai. where he actually traces the fact that these cities were developed by global architectural firms who built up the space uh, by emplacing something which is completely alien and divorced from the local environment. And this is apart from the fact that some areas were acquired to become commercial areas, which were earlier not commercial. They were made commercial and incorporated into in order to build this new kind of city. And global architectural firms themselves, as again, this may be completely old hat to all of you, but I find it very fascinating that they're actually many of them are transnational corporations, and they derive their aesthetic logic and legitimation not from local context, but from kind of a global look that clientele is looking for. And so they impose a new kind of imagination on places, so much so that all places start looking the same. So it's a kind of a placelessness that emerges. For instance, there is a striving for uniformity. For instance, in my work, when I was interviewing people from the, management people from the metro, there is a need for metro stations to look very similar, and they wanted to look like metros elsewhere, because then there is a kind of universal experience. You could be anywhere in the world, but you'll feel you're at home. So, so there is a kind of placelessness that comes into being. And when there are local elements, these are more ornamental, according to Derlick. He says that they're used more like an ornamental design element rather than an organic, locally evolved design for cities. So then you're making spatial and aesthetic choices. And as we know, all spatial choices are also ultimately social choices. Something to think about, very curious. Why is our imagination of a skyline, a city skyline, one that we continue to build from our inherited past, with its tall spires, glass and chrome that look upwards and skywards? Why is that so? Something to think about, and maybe we can talk about it. I want to end with just one little thing about how places are made by the state. All of you may be already familiar, but I'm just going to quickly talk about, I find it very fascinating that the Paris that everyone says is so wonderful and beautiful has actually been built by a houseman after clearing thousands of people who were evacuated in order to build these large boulevards which proclaimed the empire. This is post-revolution Paris, and this is post-revolution France at the time of the Napoleons. And that actually, there was a lot of strife, and the narrow old lanes of old Paris became a problem for law and order, because when there were protests against the system and against the state, they found it difficult to control it and move the police and other forces. So the whole logic of the crisscrossing lanes and the roads came about as a way of moving troops and moving law-keeping forces very quickly through the city, and also as a way of making cities legible. That is where, there are everything, it's a kind of a panopticon kind of vision of cities that can be viewed. There is nothing hidden, there is nothing, everything is open and everything is viewable and usable, and you can move through very quickly. So, so it is, again, going back to Sthala Puranas, if we look at places, there are hidden stories that lie under the layers of what the eye sees today, and there are different motivations that make it what they are. So for instance, even if we look at today what is happening with something like the Central Vista, there was a very nice article written by Mukul Keshavan who actually very clearly laid out the fact that this was what is now going to be the Central Vista was actually a place which is a public space where people could, use those little boats, they could picnic, they could come out and take the air. And how is that all going to change? And all that is going to change once this, this new project is going to come up. So, so once it's built, I guess some of us will not be around, maybe, but maybe that, the future generations just look at it and may not realize what went on before it came up. So, so it's always interesting to actually do a little bit of archaeology of a place, which is what I was trying to do with this discussion. I want to just end with a few questions. What is the public space? How is public space experienced? Is it the same for all? Who are the publics? Does it create and produce publics? And what is the social impact of spatial design? How is it used and by whom? So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. It was a really engaging lecture. I'd like to open the floor to questions now.
It would be nice if some students could at least switch on their videos. Usha, if possible, you too.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Thank you. So who wants to go first?
Salila, just to say that I did not dwell too much on the points because I thought it'll be good to talk about it. So I kept my presentation quite basic.
It was beautiful. It was perfect, and it was very evocative. I really loved the way you developed, narrated the story of the phoenix. I remember seeing that store as well, and yeah, what's there now is. It was lovely the way you did it. So thank you so much for the talk, Usha. So I'll just get Dinesh, would you like to set the ball rolling with a question?
Yeah, no, first, thanks so much for obliging me, I think. But a lot of very interesting issues, and of course we can talk for hours. So I don't know, would you like to have some kind of a structure, what we can talk about? Because there's so much to talk about, actually. I don't know, for me, I think one of the interesting things is just the fact that we are losing that sense of place across the board. And I can give you two examples. I think one is that I was in Gurugram in the heydays, and in one day I visited about 11 malls as part of my work. And every mall had an Adidas store, it had a KFC, it had a McDonald's. There was literally no difference between any of them. They were all pretty much the same. And each trying to be an iconic building in its own right, but content prices was absolutely the same. So that was one thing. And the other thing, which is that also I drive a lot. So earlier when you drove on the highway, you drove through towns and villages, you had a kind of ineffable sense that you were in a different place. The buildings would be different, the character, the density would be different. And of course, the food, local food, everything was different. Now with this grand project of infrastructure development and highways going across the place, the signage is the same, the roads are the same. We have completely lost that notion that, I'm entering a new region, a new climatic zone, a new culture. It's just going.
Right.
Yeah. So on one hand, you have this very strong tend to, like, as you said, to control and to make uniform and to tidy up and neaten, apparently organize things. And that is invariably taking a toll on the particularity of place.
Yes.
So I think for me, that's one big thing for everybody to talk about.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
Yeah.
Usha, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, and I think when we talk about placelessness, In a sense, I think that's how I understand it, where there is a kind of a monoculture of space and use and how we use spaces. And actually, we are producing a new kind of an urban subject where you have to learn how to negotiate these places. It's not like going into even like an old shopping. We used to have these shopping plazas in Bangalore, and other cities also had it, which came up in the 70s, like complexes. So these new retail spaces like malls are not even like that. You have to pass through a security guard, you have to behave in a certain way, you have to look a certain way, you have to negotiate it in a certain way, otherwise you stand out. So it is also treating you to be a certain kind of urban subject. So one is that it's losing particularity, as Dinesh pointed out, where every place is beginning to, and which is why it gives people a sense of placelessness. And that's what happened in Bangalore when this, 2008 onwards, there was this huge feeling of restlessness and angst for a lot of people because they found the city changing so quickly, they didn't know where they were. So there is that. And the second point is that it's producing a certain kind of a subject where you have to learn to use these spaces in a certain way. So you have to make yourself a certain kind of person to use it. Then what does that do? So then what is the idea of the public then? Who's the public? Who qualifies as the public?
The one thing I was wondering about, Usha, was you talked about housemanization, and then if we think about MG Road and we think about Latian's Delhi, so these were, that's what we are familiar with growing up, right? Again, because I'm kind of thinking about what you said towards the end of your talk, the coming generations, just taking the example of Central Vista, for instance, they won't know what stood there before unless someone reminds them of the ghosts, as you did today, of the shop on MG Road. So I was wondering then, is there something very different from the way we saw change in our generation and maybe what's happening now? Because now, yeah, there's that other layer of placelessness that, as you said, globalization has kind of given us a global architecture as well. And it's pretty much the same everywhere, the airports and the CBDs and all of those. So do you see a difference in maybe because we've already grown up with MG Road, and MG Road was not there before the British came there, right? So
yes, it was probably just open space.
Exactly. So then how do you think it's just a repetition of that kind of, change, or do you see something different this time over?
So I think, actually, if you look at places, Arjuna Padare very clearly puts it very well, that all places are colonized. There is no tabula rasa. You colonize it, and not literally. I mean, you take it over, make it your own, and you build, and then someone changes it. That is a process of transformation that goes on. So, and it's also dangerous to start looking at retrieving place, like as we've seen what has happened in Ayodhya, for instance. So, so that is one thing. However, I think that I'm not speaking as an anthropologist, I'm talking about it as an ordinary person now. If there is change, let's take housemanization. Nobody was involved. The public was not involved. It was a kind of a unilateral decision that was slapped on the city. Overnight, people were cleared, thousands were displaced, and these beautiful boulevards were built, which are enjoyed by everyone today. So what is the process by which this change is occurring? That is something that we need to keep in mind. So if we look at, even if it is for a quote unquote, a public purpose like a metro, what are the kinds of processes that are, employed, which are used to bring about this change? Are they transparent? Are they democratic? Do they have inputs from people who are directly affected? So I think these are questions to keep in mind. And then what is the interface of the urban planner or designer with this kind of, or is it just to design and let it go? What is your engagement with the public, so to speak, or what is your engagement on the ground? And also, who's the expert here? Surely that people who actually are on the ground might have very good alternatives. For instance, did we need a metro on MG Road? A lot of people felt we didn't need, and that it was put there because it was somehow this iconic road in Bangalore, which is sort of the, symbolized the kind of new Bangalore, the cosmopolitan Bangalore. So you put it right there, whereas you could be putting it in Electronic City and actually make decongesting the roads, but you choose to put it on MG Road and take it to Baipanhalli, all of 2-3 kilometers. For what? So that is one thing. And why put it overground? It could, after all, it could go underground. So there is a symbolism about, so anything that is spatial also is a symbolic thing. So it's proclaiming something. So, that's what I look at. I look at what meaning it is making. And so I guess then to answer your question, that this is time as it passes, but then what happens when change occurs? How is change made? Who decides change is, I think, the more pertinent way of looking at it.
Lovely.
Yeah. Thanks.
Maybe what's relevant here is that I think a lot of the earlier town planning initiatives, so to speak, were done for military purposes. Like you were saying, I think one is that the orthogonal grid was actually used because it was easy to move artillery. And, wars could be fought easily and the streets could be cleared. So two parallel things, I think, of sanitation, hygiene, and military control is what pretty much defined the designed city, so to speak.
Yeah.
But what's interesting to me also that you mentioned the word underbelly. And the underbelly was something that we were actually very comfortable with earlier. It was very much kind of interwoven into the structure of the city. You always had these pockets, which were supposedly the underbelly. But now, as Saskin says also, they're being further and further displaced.
Yeah.
And that seems to be a new change because, where do the poor live? Where do these are, I think, new issues. Salila, you are asking, is there anything that's different? For me, I think this, the expulsion of the underprivileged seems to be the one clear change that we are seeing.
And that's right. And in the context of Bangalore sort of worlding exercise, that is very clear. So it's, even if you take the case of the street vendors, somehow they have no place on the streets. They need to be asked to leave. So because they don't fit this image of the new rational clean city. Yeah, that's right. And then slums are being pushed further and further away from the city. Now they've gone to Gorguntepalia, now beyond Whitefield. Earlier they used to be in the heart of the city. So yeah, absolutely. It would be interesting to see what the pandemic, this current plague produced, these towns like Frasertown and Malleswaram and the whole design post-plague, but be interesting to see what, this pandemic, what impact it will have on how we think of cities.
In space, for sure, right? Yeah. So I was also thinking about, based on what Dinesh was saying as well, earlier, the city form was a reflection. I mean, it always is a reflection of society, which is what you said to Usha. So, and it kind of, then it's contradictory, right? On the one hand, we have participatory measures in place. So you have that too. The government actually mandates participation and calls for people to participate and give their opinions. And then there's this other planning model, which doesn't really accommodate that kind of, those kinds of inputs. So in your experience, again, you've been here and you've seen the master planning process as well. 2 iterations at least, I guess. Any thoughts on that? And how the whole, I mean,
Addressing it to me?
Yeah, to you.
Addressing it to me?
Yes.
Yeah, so this idea of participation again is actually at some levels just an idea also, although it's mandated, and Town and Country Planning Act also says that you have to involve people, you have to involve local people in changes that are made to the city. But in the course of filming our Metropolis, because when we were following so many people and through that whole process, participation does not happen in the sense of what we've seen happen and what I've seen happen is it is very closed door. It's not opened up to a larger, very simple. You're supposed to put up the details about the master plan, or maybe it's the metro map, in a place where people can access it. You put it in a place, in some obscure place where nobody can go and look at it. But in paper, you've put it up. And but you're not sending it on WhatsApp to each ward, people in each ward. You're not doing that. You're not making it accessible. Secondly, often, for instance, anything like to do with, say, this we saw particularly in the case of the metro, the alignment issues were discussed with some RWA, which was had links with the local MLA. And so it was a very closed store. Supposedly, it was not at all participation. And when the larger community demanded to be heard, they were completely actually stonewalled. So then when it's mandated to have participation, but again, how is it done? Is it done in spirit and on the ground in a way that allows for participation, or is it done to check off a box? So, to be honest, it was most non-transparent. And I wouldn't say that it actually plays out like that in the ground so far, in whatever I've observed. Even master plan, it comes at a very late stage after some consultant has given their opinions and given their proposals. And then it's also obscure. I can't understand half the things that are there. So you need to have a certain kind of, and each color signifies something else. A lot of us don't know those things. So
thanks. Other questions?
Hello, ma'am. My name is Brenda. So I had a question regarding, you spoke about those shops, like one of the shops which had to be taken down when the metro station had to be built up. And there was also this person who would orient himself well in his childhood when he was walking around there with the same shop. So now when such big projects come up and we are intervening in such in that area, where people already have their own points of orientation, how do we retain such elements there without sort of erasing their orientation and still put in our design within that set of elements through design?
Okay, thanks, Brinda. Okay, just to clarify that Phoenix Watchworks was owned by Mr. Ramchandra Sharma's father, but they were tenants. They didn't own the building, but the shop was owned by them, and they ran it for 80 years. So he ran that store after his father. And so just to say that when you say orientation, that was he spent most of his life in that shop because he ran that shop. And okay, I don't know how, first of all, I think I'm not even going to go to the backstory of how that shop was acquired. Let's keep leaving that aside. What you see now is that you see that clean facade of creamish tile with that sticker stuck with blue tape in the most crudest way, asking for people who are interested in renting a space. if you were to design, or I'm not a designer, I'm not an urban planner, but surely there is some way in which a design can incorporate or commemorate something that stood there. It sounds very artificial, it sounds very superficial, but there is no marker even of saying that something stood there. Also, if you go inside the shop, inside the metro station, it's empty space. There's nothing there, it's waste space. What if he were to have his store inside? After all, he's paying rent, right? So, I mean, that's one step further. So design can, I think, needs to think about use. And I'm sure that maybe I don't know enough about design, but this is something I feel like saying, and take it for what it is. But does it involve use also? I don't know, does that answer your question? So it's not only about maybe commemorating what was there, but in a way, can you incorporate that person or that thing into your new design? Is that possible at all? When possible?
Ma'am, hi. I wanted to, as in not raise a question as such, but it is more of an argument regarding the thought that you mentioned about the tall buildings and the buildings and structures getting taller and taller. Isn't it more related to, as in even if we see throughout the history, isn't it more related to depicting power and the person in power who is able to actually implement something of that scale, and
Yeah.
less about the less thought given to the larger good or the masses?
Yeah, I mean, height, yes, certainly. And I think it's about power. It's about proclaiming something. It's also the kind of material you use. What each material has a kind of meaning. What does it mean when you have a glass spire or something that reflects? And of course, people will argue that it's about density, that, a tall structure accommodates more people, which also may be true. But there is a certain, isn't it quite fascinating that from many, many years, we're stuck with this idea of, the spire going into
Verticality.
the sky. So yes, it is something to think about. Maybe there's no answer to it, but yes, and all emperors would have wanted to build, large towers and, the highest and whatnot. Yeah. So yeah, it is definitely about. Sorry.
Very Freudian.
Yes,
Yeah.
we shall not go there. Yes.
As in history, we see the monuments. For example, the today's monuments of when they were built in history, they were majorly done for the same reason, to proclaim a power over a certain region. Now maybe that is the same thing which is getting reflected when we are branding the city or building an image for the city, particular city. That's what we see happening in the competition with Dubai and Shanghai and few other global cities. Which tower is going to be the tallest one? Next tower.
Correct. Yes. Yes. Absolutely. Yeah.
Hi, this is Architect Deepak here. Just to add on to what we were discussing right now. So, when I was back in college, I had a professor by name Srinivas. So he did his masters in town planning in Australia or something, and he was teaching there, and he was teaching us design. And we used to go to this library, see all these pictures of these fascinating buildings and all these tall buildings with core structures and all those things. And then for one of the designs, I had made something very similar, and I took it to him. He just looked at the design and he just told me there's a huge difference between what we as people do in our country and they as people do in their country. So he was actually West, US and Europe, and he was referring to us as Indians. So we have this habit of hugging to ground. Only when it is and that too, like when it comes to a city, we tend to expand more horizontally rather than going vertically, and we go vertically only in certain places, like when for instance, like Bombay. where, you know, on almost like 3 sides we are covered by water and you have only one side to expand. And even in Chennai, that's even when you have like two, almost like one side is completely water and you have 3 sides to expand. Even there, the approach is not to go tall. It's more to go. So culturally also we have a lot of difference, but in the last 10 to 15 years, as you were rightly saying, image of the city has to be so and so. So it has to resemble something which is there in the West. You know, that seems to be like taking over really fast in the last 10 to 15 years, where people are starting to think, you know, building taller and putting this huge glass skyscrapers or concrete buildings is way of going about the city. But I think the way we use objects also, we are having generally most of the people, not everyone, we tend to buy something, keep it for a very long period of time before we throw it out. In the West, that is not the case. You buy something, you use it for almost like 1.5 years and throw it off. And probably why most of the IT companies behave in the same way, where, you know, you do something, but before it hits the market and you use it for 1 or 2 months, you have another upgraded version which is already out there in the market. So the way we use things as Indians has a lot of difference between the way they use things. That is still there. I feel that it is still there. Probably, you know, younger generations don't have it, and it's starting to change it up.
Yeah, great. Yes, thank you. That's an interesting observation. Yes.
Well, I had to go back and change my entire design after you said.
Sorry?
My professor told me that, and he showed me that, you know, that's not the way we do things here in India. I had to go back to my drawing board and change my complete design, rethink it.
Okay.
Other questions? So Usha, for me, good.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Someone had a question.
Yeah, ma'am, this is
Shalini.
Shalini. Yeah. So you spoke about Sthala Purana and also about natural history and the significance of it to a city. So I mean, what do you think about the position that a Sthala Purana or a history or a historic, I mean, a study of natural history, what is the position of that in the making or designing of a new place? Rather, how do you think it should or it should inform the design process?
That's a good question, and I'm sure there are, you know, I think Salila and Dinesh and those who are architects would probably have a better response, but I will just say whatever occurs to me. I think oftentimes we, and it's not new, I'm not saying anything new. I think we do not take into account the terrain. We tend to look at space as something that is not terrain. When I say terrain, I mean its geographical qualities. It's you know, it's kind of whether it is a slope, what kind of, is it rocky, is it sandy? I mean, does it absorb water? Does it run off water? Is it at a place where it can actually be built in such a way that it can conserve water? I mean, these are things that we are not thinking about. We see it as space to be leveled off even. So, but isn't it that now there's a very strong movement to actually incorporate the qualities of the, you know, like the qualities of the terrain itself in building? Dinesh and Salila, jump in.
That's what we preach in design school. When it meets commercial imperatives, things on the ground can be quite different, but the intention is certainly that.
And
that's why I think that's why I'm invested in the particularity of a situation. Because that's when you really start looking at all of these things.
Yeah. And for instance, even like, let's just even go to, you know, this is you know, even if you look at the metro, for instance, when it rains, there's a lot of runoff from the MG Road metro, so much so you cannot pass underneath because it just thunders on your head.
Right.
So given that also it is high ground and then it rushes down, there's no planning to even harvest that water, nothing. I mean, so I think there's very little thought given to that. Although that there is, we ought to be looking at it very seriously now, especially with climate change, creeping in. And even if we were not threatened, quote unquote, by climate change, it is something that is an organic way of relating with space. It's not something that is used. So I think the our mindset as people is to look at it as something that can be used, not something that can be related with.
Oh.
And the Sthala Puranas
I have one question.
Yeah.
Sorry. I have one question, and it's also kind of interesting to me because picking up from the Phoenix story, there's a complete change from the culture that we were used to, where I think one was that if it wasn't broken, you didn't fix it, number one.
Mm-hmm.
And number two is that if it was fixable, you fixed it,
Mm-hmm.
which meant that we repaired things. Now,
Yes.
here I see a complete break on both fronts. One is that we do things which are not necessarily required. And the second thing is that we don't salvage things. So coming back to that girl's question about, what would you do with say a Phoenix Watchworks situation? I think it's an attitudinal one that can I fix this and keep it going?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Or do I need to just throw it away?
And can I make place for it?
Yeah.
In the new?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And also, Dinesh, very interesting to play on the word fix. That's exactly what he did. He fixed old watches, old pens. He would fix them with great attention. So
yeah. But then he was fixed by the city.
Absolutely. And he was a changed person after that.
That's sad.
So.
Yeah. Just building on Dinesh's comment on particularity and, just thinking about design again. So to me, I was just wondering, so through your talk, Usha, and from your responses as well, the idea of process seems to be very important. And also the idea of, there's also this recurring theme of tolerance, which seems to have gone missing with the new way things are done right now. So, and I want to, because you're also talking, you said you're not a designer, and that's one of the reasons you are here actually today. And because you would bring a very different and very important perspective, because we all tend to work in our own silos, and perhaps that's a big part of the problem as well. So what would you say as a discipline, if you wanted to think about anthropology or any other disciplines that you wish to talk about, and what would you say that those could bring in, and this ideas of tolerance and process and particularity?
Yeah, I mean, I think what whether it's a discipline or a perspective, I would say, there's a certain perspective which disciplines teach you, and they teach you a way of looking, and it's also you. I mean, not all anthropologists are the same. Not all anthropologists look for the same thing. It's also who you are. So I think that what this kind of a anthropological eye, which is actually engages with the particular, that's what we do. We look at the particular, and we look at the nuances around the particular, and try and understand what are the meanings, what are the ways, in what way do people make sense in a particular, it could be a place, it could be a community, it could be, I don't know, it could be any kind of a micro formation. So, for instance, what that kind of eye could contribute is that before you go into designing a place, to understand the kind of layers underneath that. For instance, to look at use, it is who again, it is something that is, sociality. What is the social context of that place? How is it used what place does it have in a larger community? What place does it have in the sociality of that, what is the social kind of meaning of that place? For instance, let's just take the Metro Boulevard, for instance. The boulevard before the metro, as I was saying, is this open space. I mean, yes, the rider was that it may not have been the safest place for a single woman to walk in some odd hour. It had its negatives, but on the whole, it was an open space that was not restrictive. But then you look at what has happened today. It's all very orderly, but what is the kind of, for instance, what is the meaning of having those signs? I want to talk about those signs. I find them very interesting.
Yes.
What is the meaning of having a sign in English which says Huvina Hadi or Nagarat Pete under a metro thing? I mean, any ideas from the group? Because it relates to your question, Salila. So what are you going and intervening, and what is the history of the sociality of that place, and what are you putting in place and why? Who are you addressing? Yeah, and anyway, does anyone want to jump in?
Yeah,
related to this topic only, my cousin, he has studied second language Kannada, but he can't read second language Kannada, but he can understand it. So the Hadi was speaking about, when we went, he read it and he's like, yeah, I can understand this because it's in English. But if it was in Kannada, I wouldn't have understood. So no, it's just something that popped up in my head. Like he can't read Kannada, even though he had his second language Kannada till 10th. So, but he understands that Kannada because we are Kannadigas. So I don't know what to.
So what do you think it's doing there? I mean, who's it speaking to? Who's that sign speaking to? Right? I mean, and labeling something Huvina Hadi, which is paved, what does it actually do when actually that Huvina Hadi is gone? It's been
There's
demolished.
your marker for you, Usha. You wanted markers.
That's what I mean. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. There it is. So, but it's also addressing a certain kind of public, right? And it's also vernacularizing in a way that appeals to a global kind of audience. And to call something a Nagarat Pete doesn't make, to me, much sense in that context. It's sort of it's evoking some other place that is far away, which has nothing to do with this place. And so why? What are you trying? So you're trying to make a place which looks vernacular in this very kind of in a context that is, it could be anywhere. So just putting signage is trying to, that's how I read it. It's trying to vernacularize in a very kind of a simplistic way, when in fact that station there's nothing vernacular about that station. Our marketplaces don't have cubicles like that. Santes are opened, or it's like a different kind of a thing altogether. So it is, it's almost like a museum, I think. So coming back to your question, Salila. So, so to pay attention to the particularity in terms of a social aspect, how it is used, who is it used for, why is it used, and to keep those kinds of the use value of space, as Lefebvre says, at the topmost, and have that guide you. I think oftentimes design is about either exchange value or aesthetics of a certain kind. So I don't know if that is
That's a tough one.
whether it makes sense. I don't know, what do others think? So.
What do you think, Dinesh? You talked about the market, right? And
Yeah, well, actually, when this idea of naming also came up, in fact, I was reminded of the kind of names that developers give to their projects, and that has always been for me very fascinating and very funny. And you exactly asked the same question that Usha was asking. That who is the audience for this? Uh, where is this an aspiration? And what nostalgia points are you touching, while at the same time you're also trying to be very modern? So I think you're playing this balancing act between being relating somehow to history and nostalgia, and on the other hand you also want to be modern and contemporary and global. And these are these very contradictory threads which marketers see, and marketers see because they have skin in the game. They have something to gain.
Mhm.
So they're good anthropologists actually, but they're very cynical.
Cynical. And they're rich, are they? I don't know.
Unlike anthropologists,
Yes.
actually, for you.
So yeah. No, this idea of hybridity also pops in, right? Because that's one thing that's
Yeah.
been used to explain a lot of how these things work. Would you like to look at it from that lens, Usha?
I kind of understand hybridity in a little bit different way. I think in this particular hybridity in terms of architecture, maybe for instance, just even taking again, I'm speaking to a bunch of architects. I don't have to say this.
No,
but
don't worry about it. We are all self-doubting architects. So
like you look at the monkey tops, and the bungalow structures. That's like classic hybrid kind of, or you look at the bungalows in Mysore. It's like it's Islamic with colonial and local, all hybridized. So I would think of hybrid in a certain way. But here, if you're looking particularly at this Rangoli Center, since I brought it up, I think I tend to agree with Dinesh. It's more a kind of a exercise in evoking something, evoking a certain kind of a nostalgia, evoking a kind of a vernacular identity within a kind of a more global, whatever way you imagine global to be, context. So you're looking forward, you're modern, but you're writing in English, but you're actually calling it Huvinhadi. So I would, but yeah, I think hybridization it's more kind of, isn't it more of an organic kind of, especially in the context of your discipline, isn't it more of a organic coming together of various aspects and elements?
Yeah, but
something attend to the particular also, no?
Yeah, I guess in architecture, but I was just thinking in terms of Bhabha and how they talk about when two cultures come together and there are all these. It's not just one.
Of course,
way,
right? There's no pure culture. Where is the pure culture? It doesn't exist. There is nothing that's pure. Everything has been influenced and has influenced and taken and is syncretic in so many multiple ways. I mean, that's the way we have evolved and we'll continue to evolve. So, so that, of course, that is a given. Yeah. That is a given. And so there is no quarrel with that idea, actually. But this was very particularly kind of referencing something that the way the places can be used has changed completely. But it has changed. But it has, there's been some attempt at evoking something that existed earlier. Like you were saying, commemorative kind of a, yeah. So, and in fact, I find that very curious. And it's addressing somebody who's not actually somebody who's comfortable with English, and actually wrote a paper on this, on language and Rangoli Center. I'd love to read it at some point. Other questions, guys? Comments?
Ma'am?
Manoj, yes.
So this is just a thought. I just want you guys to help me out with this. So my mom spoke about how the pandemic might change the city, and she spoke about few spots like how they would cope up. So now we are seeing in New York that they all got vaccinated, and Biden also announced that you don't need to wear masks for some reason. Uh, and then I watch I watch a lot of football. So we see slowly fans also coming in the football stadiums. Yeah, they are maintaining social distance, but yeah, that's one part. And talking about the pandemic itself, like in a larger context, we see the Black Plague, and then there's Spanish flu, and then so these have taken more lives. I mean, this was bad enough, and sorry for all the families, but SARS hasn't come before also, and then we also see that Bill Gates has been speaking about COVID and bio wars from since a lot of time. She's speaking about it since 2010, 2015. So now, as an architect profession, like we think about all this, we think about the problems and we try to solve it, or something. We have a thought process going on, and so do we have the power, or are we capable of actually spatially changing it in a larger urban context, or do we just have to wait it out and not do much? I don't know, like how do we change it in a actual spatially, or are we capable of changing it and addressing the future pandemics? Because this has happened, and I am not sure if anything structurally or spatially they have changed. So yeah, I just wanted to.
Yeah, I mean,
talk
and I
about
think maybe Salila and Dinesh are more equipped, but I'll just say this to answer this, but I'll just say that, in fact, Malleshwaram and Baswangudi and Frasertown, Richardstown, all these areas were designed post-plague to allow for broad road setback and conservancy lanes from which night soil could be carried out in order to minimize risk of infections and spread. So there was a very strong urban planning role, right, in designing these townships. So they actually, architects probably intervened very, in a very significant way. So I think there is a place. Now, I don't know, I mean, also there is, so I think there is a place for architects and planners to incorporate the challenges of a pandemic situation. For instance, how are we going to even think of what does it actually mean to be in a group, to actually meet people? Is this pandemic actually going to, for those of us who have the luxury to have space, is it going to change the way we think of, does it, will, I think Dinesh was mentioning, right, that nowadays people have started designing houses where there's work at home spaces. You were saying that post-pandemic. So, so these are all the ways in which I think there will be significant intervention. I just had one thought though, that there is a lot of talk about even SARS and even COVID being spread through the ducts in high rises. And I was wondering whether that will do something about how high rises are designed. But to answer your question, Manoj, I think, yes, there is a significant role, but I think maybe Dinesh and Salila can take this further.
Yes, I think Usha.
One thing I
go ahead.
Can see is a huge disincentive for yeah, one thing I can see is a huge disincentive for a commuter life. So probably a return to more mixed-use neighborhoods, perhaps.
Yeah.
Walking, cycling, walking. Hopefully.
And interestingly, those
So
are the. Yeah, go ahead, Dinesh.
actually, if it's used properly.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yes. And mixed use in a certain, in a different way, like a real going back to the old kind of mixed use where you had neighborhood markets and
Downstairs,
not like the big gated community mixed use kind of thing. So,
but I think what's very it's going to be challenging for designers, I guess, is on the I think one thing that all this for physical distancing has done is remind people how important it is to have face-to-face contact. I mean conversations and stuff. In the sense, workplaces also and classrooms. We know how much our students and we have suffered, and I'm sure everyone in their own realm of work is suffering in one way or the other for lack of that contact, and the conversations happening in the classroom. So that's kind of interesting too. So on the one hand, which is why that was the theme for our design studio as well. How do you, in that kind of a scenario, how do you facilitate meeting spaces for people? And so it's on the one hand, you are compelled to stay away from each other, but it also has starkly reminded us how important it is for people to meet each other. So I think that's where the challenge is going to be. Manoj, thinking about designing also. It reminded us very, at least to me, it reminds us very forcefully of how important physical space is for people to meet and be in. And this remote stuff doesn't work all the time. It might work for some time, but not all the time. So then how do you find solutions is the question.
Yeah.
It doesn't eradicate the need for design. It just makes it more challenging, I feel.
It signals the need for more public space that can be accessed for people who don't have private space.
Very true.
Who live in congested areas, right?
Very true.
I mean, you are living in congested quarters, you need public space, which was the old thinking about parks. And if you look at Victorian England and, even America, I mean, the whole idea of parks were these open places where you came to take air because it was healthy. So the idea of public accessible, I think someone has to do that. Not everyone has the luxury of, everyone's cramped, living in cramped quarters. So we need to do that. And maybe more promenades. Yeah. More promenades, open pavilions, pipe dreams. These are.
And I think it also underlined the importance of more, I don't know, one recurring issue a lot of students had was many kids dropped out of their schools and colleges because they didn't have access to technology, right? That was one more thing that happened.
Yeah.
It's heartbreaking, but it has happened across and mostly across sections of society. And I know I had this recurring thought, if there were some spaces, community rooms, halls or whatever, where there could be computer facilities at a neighborhood level. I mean, ways in which, public resources could be consolidated to make sure these things didn't happen. So there again, space becomes important, right? It's not just the public space in the open, but also public spaces where people can have these kinds of arrangements. No, because I think that's one thing that was then missing too, right? Because people were, they didn't know where, once if you were confined in your house and you had no access to any of these facilities, how do you get on then? So I think it has just, to my mind, it has actually said we should start thinking of, as Usha said, the public realm very differently. Design in the public realm has become more important and relevant.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Does that answer your question, Manoj?
No, not exactly.
Okay, so continue. Then repeat.
We need to figure out.
So what?
I don't think it's like. So now, I understood we can design, but in an urban plan level. For example, we spoke about how it was planned for the military, you said. Is there something like that we can do in an urban plan level?
for
Open pavilions, like, can we actually propose it to the Bangalore government now? Like, is it?
I guess his question is more towards the responsibility or a role of a professional in all this process, not just architects and planners, but every kind of a professional that plays his role. And
are you talking about the scale of it, or is Ajinkya saying particular professions or professionals, roles of professionals? Manoj?
No, I'm only talking about architects.
Just the
Only about
architects?
us.
Okay,
Yeah.
and you're saying whether they can have a bigger say as a give
Yeah.
suggestions at a planning level, is what you're saying. I think there are architects doing that and not with very good results, but anyways, yeah, it is possible, right? And yeah, why not? And
I would say you're a human being first and an architect afterwards. So whenever you want to think or dream or project, you do it first as a human being. The actual exigencies of being a professional and what agency you have come later.
Yeah.
So especially when you're a student now, I think you need to really think what would be the best thing that you can possibly think of, and then later on we will address all those issues of is it doable, what are the kind of avenues which are available for it. Then do you become a protester? Do you become part of the establishment? There are many ways in which things are enabled or disabled. So don't worry too much about that right now, is what I would say. Just focus on thinking that what you think would be an ideal environment. How can you create an ideal environment? Then we'll talk about the other things.
Right.
Sure. Thank you.
other comments?
Ma'am, I'm Faria. So I was just wondering that as architecture students, we try to create interactive spaces, interactive public spaces. But you mentioned this term placelessness. So there are like, because of this ever-changing public space, people may or may not be able to cope up with the changing environment, or they may cope up with it much later. So, and then you even ask the question of who exactly is the public. So doesn't placelessness always exist, because we may not be able to satisfy every community in a public area?
Yeah, I just want to qualify what I mean by placelessness. I think Dinesh was talking about particularity of place, that earlier when you went to a place, say you went to a neighborhood or you went to a place outside, or each city, each town had its own kind of a particular nature. It had its own character. It had something that you could relate to as, oh, this is what this place is about. And if you look at a neighborhood or if you look at a city that changes very quickly, there are certain things we relate to the city as being that city. Certain orientation of roads, maybe a certain kind of a building, or maybe a certain place, maybe it's a stadium, maybe it's a cinema hall, maybe it's a clump of trees. It could be anything that, and this is very well researched in my field, that people feel that they are rooted and they have a sense of belonging when they relate to the outside. So they have ways in which they find their feet in a place because of their relationship, not only with people, but with the built environment and with the natural environment around them. So when that transforms very quickly without involving people who are in the middle of that change, it can create something called a placelessness, where what comes in its place could be a place anywhere. So I just want to qualify, that's what I mean by placelessness. And to address your second part of the question, you can't satisfy everyone at all times. Sure, yes. And there's always, if you take any situation, there's always somebody who's left out. But that would be a very cynical point to begin from. I think there has to be some kind of an attempt to understand what would make sense for a large number of people. I'm not saying majority, because sometimes you need to look at the minority. For instance, let me come back to something like physical disability. When you, and I'm so sorry to be talking about the metro, but part of my PhD is about the metro. So, and I've looked very closely at these spaces. There are places that are some parts of the station, I'm not saying only in Bangalore, it's across, or it needn't be just the metro. There may be many things, including, like small neighborhood clinics, which are inaccessible to older people. Take BTS buses or BMTC buses. Older people, people with disabilities are not able to get on. But so when you design, can you think of people who are the most vulnerable and include them in that? If, after all, they're users, right? So that is one way of looking at it. So to say that there'll always be somebody who's not happy may not be the most productive way of looking at this, because after all, you're making places for whom? For people, right? For people to use. And you need to understand use from people. You can, I think, most often places are designed and given to people to use. I think we need to turn that around.
Thank you, ma'am.
For instance, people design these grand plazas, or even, which become inaccessible to certain kinds of people. They cannot approach it. So I don't know. That's from, as I'm here to speak as an anthropologist, that's what I would say, that, coming from my discipline, that's what I would bring to the table and say, can you learn about use from how it is already being used and see who's being left out and then incorporate that.
The more
Thank
I
you,
think about
Does that make sense?
Yes,
Farah?
ma'am,
That
it
was,
does.
that was very nice.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am, it makes sense. Thank you.
For me, I think the more I think about these things, of inclusiveness and tolerance, it feels the more and more we see these things, I feel like it's about not depriving people of choices. And when you're creating new choices, you shouldn't eliminate others, is what I feel. And I feel maybe that is one of the big problems right now. You start seeing a city in a certain way, and then you eliminate those other possibilities, and then
Yes.
and that is where the
Yes.
problem is. So it feels like, let them coexist and create space for, and make space for both. Don't take away something that's already there. And I think that's the challenge as well.
Yeah. And we were talking about what not fixing what is not broken, that same kind of thing. Something that's working well, why do you want to replace it by something that is exotic, So, and it comes down to what are you projecting then? No, that's the bottom question. What are you projecting with this?
Any other questions, guys? Dinesh gave a very interesting talk, very riveting talk the other day on the slow city, and he
walking. We are the generation that's walked everywhere and cycled everywhere.
So then, are there any spaces that remain from your childhood that you still go back to?
Difficult, yeah. Well, there are the parks, but I was in Lalbagh recently, and I was not allowed to use a camera, and I was very upset.
Really?
That's terrible.
Yeah, they don't allow. Photography is not allowed.
In Lalbagh?
Of course. Yeah, you can't. Of course, you can use your mobile phone. You can use your mobile phone, but you can't carry a camera in there.
They have a problem
Can
with
you
the
imagine?
tech, not the visitors.
So I was very upset because my memory is that we could do anything we wanted in Lalbagh. I cycled through Lalbagh every day on my way to school. So
we used to walk through Lalbagh to go home, and what remains? Cubbon Park so far, but then we don't know how long that will last. Even now, there are all these security guards, but yeah, there are bits and pieces that exist, and there are bits and pieces that are gone. And unless I have a kind of an elephantine memory, but if I didn't, maybe I won't even miss it.
Yeah.
And yeah, so certainly there are some places which are still walkable, which is nice. And largely wherever there's the military presence, it's changed less. For instance, Cubbon Road has changed less. And so I guess there's some of it does exist. Coffee Board exists. It's the same. They have the 50 sofas still. Certain markets are still the same. And Alsur, by and large, Alsur market remains the same. There's shops that I used to see as a kid passing by in a school bus that still remain. I don't know for how long, because the metro is there.
Right.
So a lot of real estate changes happening in Alsur. So yeah, so there are some spots. Although yeah, that's a different talk. All the things that have gone will be a different talk.
All the things that you could actually build a talk on the ghosts of spaces. I think that would be fantastic, right? I mean, not fantastic. I mean, not fantastic it's a sad thing, but at least the talk would be fantastic, is what I was saying. Deepak, you were saying something.
No, I was just telling Dinesh that he should lie next time when entering.
Sorry, about what?
Carry your camera inside. Don't tell them.
No, actually what happened, I had a huge fight with the guards. And I used my camera. And when I came back home and I Googled it, I found out that actually they were right and I was wrong.
So what's the rationale?
That's the same. All the ASI protected monuments, we are not allowed to sketch. But the actual is you cannot sketch with the easel, that board which is supposed to be screwed, the olden ones, which the Britishers and.
So like you can't shoot a tripod. So they have something against tripods, basically.
Yeah, so the olden tripod, you need to screw it to the but that damages the monument.
What?
2 legs good, 3 legs bad. Huh?
Yeah.
Even Cubbon Park you can't shoot, sir. The local horticulture department have announced it's a ban. You can't professional shoots in Cubbon Park. It's banned.
What was happening before the COVID? Whenever I walked in Cubbon Park, I would see at least 5 modeling shoots.
Oh, minimum. That's the reason.
And wedding shoots, like spectacular wedding, like post-wedding, pre-wedding shoots.
Right.
And people would actually carry these mobile tents and to change clothes.
Why is the DBMP engaging in Schadenfreude? What's wrong if people do that?
It's a public place, So
that's where they would do it then. Because I remember seeing a similar thing in Central Park in New York. It's just, and it's actually a lovely spectacle also, right? For the time that it happens.
Yeah, it's great fun.
For others
it's
also.
It's great fun,
yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
No, especially these Korean couples. They do a lot of this all over the world. Yeah.
So there's I've seen some spectacular things, like from Cinderella kind of outfits to, actually posing, and it's just fabulous.
No, and that is the spectacle of the city as well, right? Lefebvre also talks about it, and people make the city with their appropriate space temporarily and in other ways as well.
Yes.
And that's what makes the city what it is. Right?
That's right. That's
Usha, I don't know. I'm sure there must be studies done on the sanitizing impulse of government.
Yes. Yes.
I'm sure it's a thing, no?
Yeah, absolutely. And sanitizing without, in a most kind of innocuous and, under sort of, it's never openly said that it's sanitizing, but it has an effect of sanitizing actually, and that's the way it happens, I think. And much of the actually even things like road widening and displacing certain kinds of shops and vendors and all is part of a sanitizing kind of a activity of rationalizing and sanitizing. And if you look at it literally, there's very little that we are actually doing to literally sanitize. I mean, if you look at the way we treat waste, for instance, and the fact is that we still do not have, waste pickup lorries, which people are still using their hands for treating waste. So,
so is it more that they are trying to create a landlord-tenant situation wherever possible?
So there is, I think there is a lot of, how do you see that in any particular context, Dinesh?
No, in the sense that the moving of apparently disorganized labor and market. The only gain I can see from it is that people are pushed into a rental kind of a situation.
Yes, either you have to formally rent or you have to be licensed. So it's you're coming under the scrutiny, and you have to be documented. That's one thing. And secondly, it is also land use is changing. The widening of roads, as you all know, is increasing the FSA. And then it also means that a certain kind of real estate development takes place there. And so on the one hand, that is happening. On the other hand, then you're creating this whole pool of people who have to be licensed, documented in order to ply their trade. And most often people fall through the cracks. They're not able to do it and there's a lot of study done on it. And in fact, ALF, there's Vinay Srinivasa, who has been working with the street vendors. And so this whole business of licensing and all is not that simple. It's not that easy. And also these are again places that people come there to answer, I think, Freya's question, or somebody else had asked. So if you're sitting on a street, you're not sitting randomly. You've been there for years and people have been buying from you. You've established a kind of a connect with the community. And suddenly to be taken out of there is not going to be and put somewhere else. It's not going to be easy for you to develop your market again. Does that?
There used to be a legal principle which said that occupation is, I think, 50% of possession or something like that. But I don't see that really being used in a way.
No, and in fact, apparently some of the plans, like for instance, the city plans don't even mark these vendor zones, so that they appear as empty spaces, or even if there are smaller shops. I think Shetty talks about it from Bombay.
Prasad Shetty. Prasad Shetty?
Prasad Shetty. Yeah. Prasad Shetty, I remember one of his presentations, and also in Bangalore, they were saying that, so these are not even marked. So they appear empty. So you say, so actually, when you actually go in, there's actual people there, there's structures there, but they don't appear because they're not regularized. So all this is, so it does, I think, it doesn't allow for gray areas of, like operation, possession. In fact, our world is not black and white, never has been. There are always some in between people. There's, people in the mud, sort of intersection of things. And I think one has to be accommodating of that, because otherwise you also create dispossession, like that. And also, Dinesh, to come back to your owner-tenant thing, even when properties are acquired for demolition, the people who benefit are the owners of the property, not the tenants. Tenants may
Yeah.
be there for 80 years, but they get very little, they don't get compensation. They just get some little bit of money.
So maybe Faria, then our job as designers, urban designers, is to accommodate more of the gray and rather than worrying about it, right? So that's how we can, as designers, can contribute to the design of public spaces, other spaces as well. Right? So,
Yes, ma'am.
You know, I always say that when like you have cells and you have, you know, intercellular fluid, the juice is always in the gaps. It's
Yep. Yeah, because it's also fluid, right? It's just those those are not walls, they're permeable. So good analogy.
so I think if there are no more questions, shall we wrap up? It's almost 8 o'clock. Yeah, Dinesh, Usha?
Yep.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am, for the evocative and highly energetic session today.
Thank you for
I'd like
inviting
to
me.
thank the students and the other faculty members as well who've been part of the session. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much,
Thanks
Usha.
a lot and stay well, keep well, everyone.
You too.
Yeah.
Take care. Thanks,
Yeah,
Dinesh.
thank you.
Thanks, Shalini.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Dinesh, Salima,
Bye.
everyone
Bye.
else. Bye.
Have a lovely evening. Bye.
You too.